Hello, fabulous scholars. We left off in a sort of exciting place yesterday. We figured out that the three animals that had been visiting Odd were actually Odin, Thor, and Loki from Norse mythology. And then they were talking about something that went horribly wrong, and it seems to be Loki's fault, although Loki is still saying it could have happened to anyone. So let's see what happens. Oh, that's right. So Loki had seen this most beautiful of women when he was just standing on top of the wall that protects Asgard, where the gods lived, and was having a conversation with her. And he offers to have her come stay with him. And she says she can't do that unless he can give her one thing. And Loki's like, well, what do you want? And here we go. Mjolnir, said the maiden. The hammer of Thor. Ha ha ha! Pausing only to tell her not to go anywhere, my feet flew, and like the wind, I rushed into the great hall. They were all asleep, so it didn't matter. There was Thor, his face in a gravy-covered wooden trencher, and hanging from his side, his hammer. Only the nimble fingers of Loki, the wiliest and cleverest, could have teased it from his belt without him noticing. At this, the bear made a deep noise in the back of its throat. After glaring at it for a moment, the fox said, "And heavy it was, that hammer. Heavier than people dream. It weighed as much as a small mountain. Too heavy to carry if you are not Thor, and yet it was not too much for my genius. I took off my shoes, which, as I said, can walk on the air, and I tied them, one to the handle and one to the head. Then I snapped my fingers, and the hammer followed me. This time I hurried to the gates of Asgard. I unbarred them, and I walked through, followed, I do not need to tell you, by the hammer." The maiden was there. She was sitting on a boulder, and she was weeping. "Why the tears, oh loveliness itself?" I asked. At that, she looked up at me with a tear-stained face. "I weep because once I saw you, great and noble lord, I knew I could never love another, and yet I am doomed to give my heart only to he who lets me touch the hammer of Thor." I reached out a hand and touched her cold, wet cheek. "Dry your tears," I told her, "and behold the hammer of Thor." Or a black cat. She stopped crying then and reached out her delicate hands and held the hammer tightly. Let's picture the maiden holding the hammer. I reckoned I could still chat with the lady and get the hammer back into the hall before Thor woke up, but we would need to get a move on. "Now," I said, "about that kiss." For a moment, I thought she'd begun to cry again, and then I knew she was laughing. But the noise she was making was not a sweet, tinkling, maidenly laugh. It was a deep, crashing noise, like an ice sheet grinding against a mountainside. The maiden pulled my shoes from the hammer and dropped them to the ground. She held the hammer as if it were a feather. A wave of cold engulfed me, and I found myself looking up at her. To make matters worse, she wasn't even a she any longer. She was a man. Well, not a man. I mean, male, yes, but as big as a high hill with icicles hanging from its beard. And he said, "After so long, all it took was one oath, and Asgard is ours." So, not a lovely maiden, but a Jotun, a frost giant. Oops. Then the frost giant peered down at me, and he gestured with the hammer of Thor. "And you," he said in a deep and extremely satisfied voice, "you need to be something else." I felt my back pushing up. I felt a tail pushing its way out from the base of my spine. My fingers shrank into paws and claws. It wasn't the first time I turned into an animal form. I was a horse once, but this is the first time that it was imposed on me by someone else, and it was not a nice feeling. Not a nice feeling at all. It was worse for us, said the bear. One moment you're fast asleep, dreaming about thunderstorms, and the next you're being scrunched into a bear. They turned the Allfather into an eagle. Eagle screeched, startling Odd. Rage! It said. Well, the giant laughed at us, waving my hand. Oh, sorry. Wrong voice. The giant laughed at us, waving my hammer around all the while, and then he forced Heimdall to summon the Rainbow Bridge and exiled the three of us to Midgard. That means they had to leave Asgard. They couldn't go back. There's no more to tell. There was silence then in the tiny hut, only the crackle and spit of a pine branch on the fire. Well, said Odd, gods or not, I can't keep feeding you. If this winter keeps going, I don't think I can keep feeding me. We won't die, said the bear, because we can't die here, but we will get hungry, and we'll get more wild, more animal. It's something that happens when you have to take on an animal form. If you stay in it too long, then you become what you pretend to be. When Loki was a horse... We don't talk about that, said the fox. So here's Loki remembering. So is that why the winter isn't ending? Said Odd. The frost giants like the winter. They are the winter, said the bear. And if spring never comes, if summer doesn't happen, if the winter just goes on forever? The bear said nothing. The fox swished its tail impatiently. They looked to the eagle. It tilted its head back, and with one fiery yellow eye, it stared at Odd. Then it said, Death! Eventually, added the fox. Not immediately, like in a year or so. And some creatures will go south, but most of the people and the animals will die. It's happened before, back when we had wars with the frost giants at the dawn of time. When they won, huge sheets of ice would cover this part of the world. And when we won, and if it took us 100,000 years, we always did, the ice sheets would retreat and the spring would return. But we were gods then, not animals. And I had my hammer, said the bear. Well then, said Odd, we'll set off as soon as it gets light enough to travel. Set off? Said the fox. For where? Asgard, of course, said Odd, and he smiled his infuriating smile. Then he went back to his little bed, and he went to sleep. We'll find out what happens when they head to Asgard next time. Bye, scholars.